They started as fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary men. But their deaths were anything but ordinary. What I am about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about the 12 disciples of Jesus. These weren't men who died peacefully in their beds surrounded by family. These were martyrs who faced torture, crucifixion, beheading, and horrors so brutal that even Roman executioners were amazed by their courage. Picture this: Peter, the denier who became a rock, hanging upside down on a cross because he felt unworthy to die the same way as his master. Imagine Andrew, who first brought his brother to Jesus, tied to an X-shaped cross for 3 days, preaching to his executioners until his final breath. Envision James the Greater being beheaded by King Herod while crowds cheered, becoming the first apostolic martyr. But here's what will shock you most: not one of them recanted. Not one of them backed down. Not one of them chose to save their lives by denying the Christ they had walked with, talked with, and witnessed rise from the dead. Their deaths weren't just endings, they were testimonies. Their final moments weren't just suffering, they were sermons that echoed through eternity. What kind of truth would make ordinary men face extraordinary deaths? What kind of conviction would drive simple fishermen to choose torture over compromise? What did they see? What did they know? What did they experience that made death preferable to denial? The answer lies not just in how they died, but in why they chose to die. Because when you understand the terrifying end of the 12 disciples, you'll understand the unshakable foundation of the Christian faith. You will see that these men didn't die for a philosophy or a movement. They died for a person they knew was alive. To understand why these men died so courageously, we have to go back to the moment that transformed them from frightened followers into fearless martyrs. It wasn't just the crucifixion that changed them. Plenty of good men had been crucified before Jesus. It wasn't just his teachings. Other rabbis had taught profound truths. It was what happened 3 days after they watched him die. Picture the scene. 11 men huddled in an upper room, doors locked, hearts broken, dreams shattered. They had given up everything to follow this Jesus of Nazareth. They had believed he was the Messiah who would restore Israel's kingdom. They had seen him heal the sick, raise the dead, feed thousands with a boy's lunch. But now he was dead, and they were terrified they would be next. Then suddenly he was there. Not as a ghost, not as a vision, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing, nail-scarred reality. Thomas thrust his finger into the wounds. They watched him eat fish. They felt his embrace. This wasn't a psychological experience or a religious hallucination. This was the stone-cold fact that death itself had been defeated. John 20:20 records their reaction. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. But it was more than joy, it was revolutionary certainty. These men had touched the impossible. They had witnessed the unthinkable. They had seen death swallowed up in victory. From that moment, they were no longer the same men who had fled in terror when Jesus was arrested. They were now men who had seen beyond the grave, who knew with absolute certainty that death was not the end, who understood that the man they had followed was indeed God in flesh. This is why they could face their terrifying ends with supernatural courage. This is why torture couldn't break them, and death couldn't silence them. They were undying for a belief. They were dying for a person they knew was alive and waiting for them on the other side. But the path from that upper room to their final moments was paved with persecution, suffering, and a courage that defied human explanation. Simon Peter, the impulsive fisherman who had denied Jesus 3 times during his trial, became the most unlikely rock upon which the early church was built. But his transformation came at a price that would ultimately cost him everything. After Pentecost, Peter was a man possessed not by demons, but by an unstoppable conviction that Jesus was Lord. He preached with such power that 3,000 people were converted in a single day. He healed the lame, raised the dead, and boldly proclaimed Christ before the same Sanhedrin that had condemned his master. But Peter's boldness made him a marked man. According to early church historian Eusebius, and confirmed by church fathers like Clement of Rome. Peter spent his final years in Rome, establishing and leading the church in the heart of the empire. It was here that Nero's persecution would catch up with him. Picture the scene. Rome is burning, and Nero needs someone to blame. The Christians, with their strange religion and their refusal to worship Caesar, make perfect scapegoats. Peter, as the leader of the Roman church, becomes a prime target. The soldiers come for him in the night, dragging the old fisherman from his hiding place to face the most brutal form of execution the Romans had devised. But here's where the story takes an extraordinary turn. According to ancient tradition recorded by early church fathers, when Peter was brought to his crucifixion, he made an astonishing request. He asked to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Can you imagine that level of humility in the face of death? If this story of Peter's transformation from denier to martyr is impacting you, hit that like button right now. And let me know in the comments, what would it take for you to face death with that kind of courage? Tradition tells us that Peter's crucifixion was a spectacle that drew crowds throughout Rome. Here was this elderly man, hanging upside down on a Roman cross, and instead of cursing his executioners or begging for mercy, he was preaching. For hours, as the blood rushed to his head and his body convulsed in agony, Peter proclaimed the gospel to anyone who would listen. The Roman historian Tacitus, though no friend of Christianity, recorded that the Christians died with such extraordinary courage that it actually began to turn public opinion in their favor. People began to wonder, what could make ordinary people face such deaths with such peace? Peter died as he had learned to live after the resurrection, as a rock, unmovable, unshakable, proclaiming to his final breath that Jesus Christ was Lord. The man who had once warmed himself by a fire while denying he knew Jesus now died in flames rather than deny him again. Andrew holds a special place in the gospel narrative as the first disciple called, and the one who brought his brother Peter to Jesus. But his end would prove that first doesn't always mean easiest, and his death would become one of the most prolonged and agonizing in the history of Christian martyrdom. After the resurrection, Andrew took the gospel to regions that would test his faith in ways unimaginable. Church tradition places him in Scythia, modern-day Ukraine, and southern Russia, Epirus, and finally in Patras, Greece, where his preaching began to threaten the established order. The proconsul Egeates became increasingly frustrated with Andrew's influence. The apostles' preaching was converting not just common people, but members of the nobility, including Egeates' own wife, Maximilla. When Andrew refused to stop preaching and actually had the audacity to call the proconsul to repentance, Egeates decided to make an example of him. But Andrew's execution would be different from his brother Peter's. Instead of a traditional upright cross, Egeates ordered that Andrew be bound to an X-shaped cross, a diagonal cross. That would prolong his suffering while putting him on display for maximum humiliation. Picture the horror. Andrew was tied, not nailed, to this diagonal cross so that his death would be slow and excruciating. The ropes cut into his flesh as his body weight pulled against them. The position made breathing difficult, blood circulation nearly impossible, and death a slow, agonizing process that could take days. But here's what made Andrew's martyrdom legendary. He preached continuously for 3 days. While hanging on that cross, tortured and dying, Andrew proclaimed the gospel to everyone who passed by. Crowds gathered not just to watch a man die, but to hear a man preach as he was dying. The historical account from the Acts of Andrew records that Andrew actually rebuked the crowds for trying to take him down from the cross. When they saw his condition and began demanding his release, Andrew told them that he would not allow his suffering to be cut short because he was looking forward to being with his Lord. For 3 days and 3 nights, Andrew hung on that X-shaped cross. For 3 days and 3 nights, he preached about the love of Christ. For 3 days and 3 nights, he demonstrated that there are things worth dying for and someone worth dying to see. James, the son of Zebedee and brother of John, earned the nickname the Greater, not just for his age, but for the magnitude of his faith and the significance of his sacrifice. He would have the dark honor of being the first of the 12 to die for the faith, and his death would set the pattern for the persecution that was to come. James was part of the inner circle, one of only 3 disciples who witnessed the transfiguration, who were present when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter, and who accompanied him to the Garden of Gethsemane. He had seen Jesus in his glory and in his agony. He had witnessed both the divine power and the human suffering of his master. But it was James's boldness in preaching the resurrection that made him a target. Acts 12:1-2 records the stark reality with brutal simplicity. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. Just 14 words in the English translation. But behind those 14 words lies a story of courage that would inspire martyrs for 2,000 years. According to early church tradition recorded by Clement of Alexandria, James's execution became an unexpected evangelistic opportunity. As James was being led to his death, his accuser, the man who had brought charges against him, was so moved by the apostle's courage and peace that he experienced a dramatic conversion. Think about that for a moment. Even his executioner was converted by his courage. If you're being inspired by these stories of supernatural faith, make sure you resubscribe with notifications on, because we're just getting started with these incredible accounts of martyrdom. The accuser fell at James's feet and begged forgiveness. Then, in an extraordinary display of Christian brotherhood, James embraced the man who had condemned him and said, "Peace be with you." Both men were then led to their execution together, the apostle and his former enemy, now brothers in Christ. Herod intended James's execution to be a deterrent to the growing Christian movement. Instead, it became a catalyst. The sight of James facing death with such courage, the conversion of his accuser, and the Christian community's response to persecution only served to spread the gospel further. James died by the sword, but his death became a sword that pierced the hearts of those who witnessed it. He was the first of the 12 to follow Jesus to martyrdom, but he would not be the last. His death opened the floodgates of persecution, but it also opened hearts to the reality that these men possessed something worth dying for. Of all the 12 disciples, John's story stands out, not because of how he died, but because of how he didn't die. While his 11 brothers were martyred for their faith, John lived to old age, but that doesn't mean he escaped suffering. His story reveals that sometimes God's will includes surviving torture, and that living when others die can require just as much faith as dying for the cause. John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, the one who leaned on his breast at the Last Supper, the one to whom Jesus entrusted his mother from the cross, faced his own terrifying end multiple times. But each time, divine intervention spared his life in ways that defied explanation. According to church tradition recorded by Tertullian and other early historians, John's first brush with martyrdom came during Domitian's persecution in Rome. The emperor ordered that John be thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil as a public spectacle. Picture the scene. Crowds gathered to watch the last of Jesus' inner circle meet his gruesome end. The oil was heated to temperatures that would instantly kill any human being. But then the impossible happened. John was thrown into the boiling oil and emerged unharmed. Not burned, not scalded, not even injured. The crowd that had come to watch a Christian die instead witnessed a miracle that converted many of them on the spot. Frustrated and perhaps terrified by this supernatural intervention, Domitian banished John to the island of Patmos, a desolate rock in the Aegean Sea that served as a Roman penal colony. Here, among criminals and political prisoners, the aged apostle experienced visions that would become the book of Revelation. But John's survival came with its own form of suffering. He watched as, one by one, his fellow apostles were tortured and killed for the faith they all shared. He carried the burden of being the last living witness to Jesus' earthly ministry. He endured the loneliness of outliving all his closest friends and the weight of preserving the apostolic witness for future generations. When John finally died peacefully in Ephesus around 100 AD, he was nearly 100 years old. He had lived through the destruction of Jerusalem, the persecution under Nero, the reign of Domitian, and the establishment of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. His long life was a testimony to God's sovereignty. Sometimes preserving life is just as miraculous as accepting death. Philip, the disciple who brought Nathanael to Jesus with this simple invitation, "Come and see," would ultimately extend that same invitation at the cost of his own life. His martyrdom in Hierapolis would become one of the most brutal and prolonged executions in the history of the early church. Philip spent his later years evangelizing in Asia Minor, particularly in the region around modern-day Turkey. His preaching in Hierapolis was so effective that it began to threaten the economic foundation of the city, which was built around pagan temple worship and the occult practices associated with the god Apollo. The turning point came when Philip performed an extraordinary miracle. According to the apocryphal Acts of Philip, he cast out a demonic serpent that was being worshipped in the temple of Apollo. The serpent's death and Philip's bold proclamation of Christ caused many to abandon their pagan practices and turn to Christianity. This supernatural confrontation enraged the city's religious and political leaders. They arrested Philip along with his traveling companion, Bartholomew, and a Christian woman named Mariamne. What followed was a carefully orchestrated execution, designed to maximize both suffering and humiliation. Philip was crucified upside down, like Peter, but with an additional torture. While hanging on the cross, he was also stoned by the crowd. Imagine the agonizing combination, the blood rushing to his head as he hung inverted, while stones struck his body and sharp rocks cut his flesh. But even in this extreme torture, Philip displayed the same invitation spirit that had characterized his entire ministry. As stones pelted his body and his life ebbed away, he preached to his executioners. He invited them to come and see the Christ who was giving him strength to endure such suffering. The historical account records that Philip's courage during his execution was so extraordinary that it caused an earthquake that destroyed part of the temple of Apollo and killed several of his executioners. This supernatural response to his martyrdom led to mass conversions among the surviving witnesses. These aren't just ancient stories. These are testimonies to the power of unshakable faith. If these accounts of supernatural courage are strengthening your own faith, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to see what real conviction looks like. Philip died as he had lived, inviting others to come and see Jesus. His final sermon was preached not from a pulpit, but from a cross, not with eloquent words, but with supernatural endurance. The man who had once said to Jesus, "Show us the Father," became a living demonstration of the Father's power to sustain his children through the darkest valleys. Nathanael, also known as Bartholomew, was the disciple of whom Jesus said, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." His honesty and transparency in life would be matched by the horrific transparency of his death, literally flayed alive for refusing to worship idols. After the resurrection, Bartholomew carried the gospel to some of the most dangerous and remote regions of the ancient world. Church tradition places him in India, Armenia, and possibly even as far as modern-day Azerbaijan. It was in Armenia that his evangelistic success would ultimately lead to his gruesome martyrdom. Bartholomew's preaching in Armenia had been extraordinarily successful. He had converted thousands, including members of the royal family, and had established a strong Christian church in a region dominated by pagan worship. But his greatest triumph would also be his downfall. King Astyages' brother had been converted through Bartholomew's ministry, and this personal affront to the royal family could not be tolerated. The king ordered Bartholomew's arrest and demanded that he worship the Armenian gods. When Bartholomew not only refused but boldly proclaimed that these idols were demons masquerading as gods, Astyages decided to make his death a warning to all Christians. The torture they devised was designed to be the most painful and humiliating possible. Bartholomew would be flayed alive, literally skinned while still conscious. This method of execution was reserved for the most serious criminals and was intended to maximize both physical agony and psychological terror. Picture the unimaginable horror. Bartholomew was bound to a wooden frame while his executioners slowly, methodically removed his skin with sharp knives. This wasn't a quick death. It was a prolonged torture designed to break his spirit and force him to recant his faith. But historical accounts record that throughout this unthinkable agony, Bartholomew continued to praise God and proclaim the gospel. Even as his flesh was stripped away, his spirit remained unbreakable. Even as his body was systematically destroyed, his voice continued to witness for Christ. The executioners expected screams of agony and pleas for mercy. Instead, they heard hymns of praise and declarations of faith. The crowd that had gathered to watch a Christian break under torture instead witnessed a display of supernatural strength that defied human explanation. Bartholomew's flaying became an unwitting testimony to the reality of the resurrection. Only someone who was absolutely certain of life beyond death could face such torture with such peace. Only someone who had seen the risen Christ could maintain faith while their body was literally torn apart. The symbol of Bartholomew became a flaying knife, not as a symbol of his suffering, but as a symbol of his victory over the worst that human cruelty could devise. The man without deceit died the most honest death possible, holding nothing back, hiding nothing, transparent to the very end. Matthew, the former tax collector who had left everything to follow Jesus, would ultimately give everything, including his life, for the privilege of continuing to follow him. The man who had once collected taxes for Rome would die refusing to pay tribute to false gods. After the resurrection, Matthew initially ministered to the Jewish communities, probably authoring his gospel during this period. But eventually, like his fellow apostles, he ventured into foreign lands to spread the message of Christ. Church tradition places him in Ethiopia, Persia, and possibly Syria, where his background as a tax collector gave him unique insights into dealing with government officials and wealthy merchants. It was in Nadavur, Ethiopia, that Matthew's ministry would reach its climax and his life would reach its end. His preaching had been so effective that he had converted the king's son and many members of the royal court. But when the king himself died and a new, militantly anti-Christian ruler took power, Matthew's days became numbered. King Hyrtacus saw Christianity as a threat to both his political power and the traditional religious practices that legitimized his rule. Matthew's influence among the nobility was particularly threatening because it undermined the king's authority. When Matthew refused to stop preaching and actually had the audacity to call the king to repentance, Hyrtacus decided to make a public example of him. According to early church accounts, Matthew was killed while celebrating the Eucharist. Picture the scene: the former tax collector, now an aged apostle, leading a Christian congregation in the breaking of bread and the sharing of wine. As he lifted the cup and spoke the words, "This is my blood, shed for you," soldiers burst into the gathering. Some traditions say Matthew was run through with a spear while still holding the communion cup. Others record that he was beheaded at the altar. But all accounts agree on this. Matthew died in the act of communion, literally giving his life while commemorating Christ's death. The symbolism is incredible, isn't it? Matthew died while celebrating the fact that Christ died for him. If these stories are showing you what it means to live and die for something greater than yourself, I need you to hit that subscribe button and share this with everyone you know. There's profound symbolism in Matthew's death during communion. The man who had once taken from others in service to Rome was now given everything in service to Christ. The hands that had once counted coins were now broken in service to the one who had called him from his tax booth. Matthew's death while celebrating communion also carries prophetic significance. Throughout history, Christians have continued to face persecution while gathered for worship. From the Roman catacombs to modern-day underground churches, Believers have risked their lives to remember him in bread and wine. The former tax collector's martyrdom reminds us that no background disqualifies someone from ultimate sacrifice for Christ. Whether you've been a fisherman like Peter, a zealot like Simon, or even a collaborator like Matthew, the call to follow Jesus includes the willingness to die for him. Thomas, forever known as Doubting Thomas for his initial skepticism about the resurrection, would prove through his death that once convinced, he never doubted again. His martyrdom in India would demonstrate that. Former doubters can become the most committed believers. After touching Jesus' wounds and declaring, "My Lord and my God," Thomas was transformed. Church tradition records that he traveled farther than any other apostle, carrying the gospel all the way to India. The Mar Thoma Christians of southern India trace their origins directly to Thomas's ministry, and archaeological evidence supports the presence of a thriving Christian community there in the 1st century. Thomas's preaching in India was remarkably successful. He established churches, ordained local leaders, and converted people from all levels of society, from peasants to nobility. But it was his success among the upper classes that would ultimately lead to his death. The Hindu priests and local rulers saw Thomas's growing influence as a threat to the established order. His message of salvation through Christ alone directly challenged the caste system and the multitude of Hindu deities that formed the foundation of Indian society. When several prominent nobles converted to Christianity, the religious authorities decided Thomas had to be eliminated. According to the Acts of Thomas, one of the earliest Christian documents about his ministry, Thomas was martyred at St. Thomas Mount, near present-day Chennai. The method of his execution was designed to be both painful and symbolic. He was pierced through with spears, in a deliberate echo of how he had touched Jesus' spear wound. But the details of Thomas's death reveal the same thoroughness that had characterized his initial doubt. When he doubted the resurrection, he didn't just express casual skepticism, he demanded physical proof. When he faced death, he didn't just accept it passively, he used every moment to proclaim the Christ he had touched and known. Historical accounts record that as Thomas was being pierced with spears, he continued to preach about the wounds of Christ. The man who had once needed to touch Jesus' wounds was now experiencing his own wounds for Jesus' sake. The one who had said, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe," was now offering his own hands inside to be pierced for the one he could no longer doubt. Thomas's martyrdom has particular relevance for modern skeptics and doubters. His story proves that intellectual honesty and genuine faith are not incompatible. The same mind that demanded evidence for the resurrection became convinced beyond any possibility of doubt. The same person who needed proof became willing to die for that proof. The apostle who once doubted died without a shadow of doubt, proving that encountering the risen Christ transforms skeptics into martyrs, questioners into believers, and doubters into disciples willing to die for their Lord. James the Less, also called James the son of Alphaeus to distinguish him from James the Greater, lived up to his nickname by maintaining a low profile throughout the Gospels. But his quiet faithfulness in life would be matched by a quiet courage in death that spoke volumes about the depth of his conviction. Very little is recorded about James the Less in the New Testament, but this doesn't mean his faith was any less real or his commitment any less total. Church tradition fills in some of the gaps, placing him in ministry throughout Judea and possibly Egypt, where his gentle approach and steady faithfulness attracted many to the faith. According to early church historians, James the Less was martyred in either Egypt or Syria, depending on which tradition you follow. But both accounts agree on the method. He was beaten to death with a club, a form of execution that was both brutal and prolonged. Picture the horror, unlike a quick beheading or even crucifixion, which eventually brought death through asphyxiation or blood loss. Being beaten to death with clubs meant enduring blow after blow until the body simply couldn't continue. This method of execution was designed to be both physically devastating and psychologically demoralizing. But historical accounts suggest that James the Less faced this brutal death with the same quiet steadiness that had characterized his entire ministry. There were no dramatic last words recorded, no spectacular miracles, no supernatural interventions. Just a quiet man dying quietly for an unquiet truth that had revolutionized his life. Sometimes the most powerful testimonies are the quiet ones. Sometimes the most convincing witnesses are those who don't seek attention, but simply remain faithful. James the Less proved that you don't have to be a prominent leader or a dramatic personality to be a powerful witness for Christ. His death by clubbing also reminds us that martyrdom comes in many forms. Not every Christian is called to the spectacular suffering of a crucifixion or flaying. Some are called to the steady faithfulness of enduring repeated blows, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, while maintaining their testimony to the very end. There's something powerful about quiet faithfulness, isn't there? If you're inspired by these ordinary men who chose extraordinary deaths for their faith, let me know in the comments which disciple's story has impacted you most. And make sure you stay until the end, because we still have more shocking accounts to cover. Simon the Zealot had been a revolutionary before he met Jesus, a member of the radical Jewish party that advocated violent overthrow of Roman rule. But following Christ transformed his zeal from political revolution to spiritual revolution, and his death would prove that some causes are worth dying for. The Zealots were known for their willingness to die rather than submit to foreign rule. They carried daggers called sicarii and weren't hesitant to use them against Romans or Jewish collaborators. When Simon encountered Jesus, his revolutionary passion didn't disappear. It was redirected toward a higher kingdom and a greater cause. Church tradition places Simon's final ministry in Persia, where he partnered with Jude, also called Thaddeus, in evangelizing regions that had never heard the gospel. Their preaching was so effective that it threatened the Zoroastrian priests who controlled the religious life of the Persian Empire. Simon's background as a zealot made him particularly effective in reaching other revolutionaries and political dissidents. He understood the passion for freedom that drove men to risk everything for a cause. But now he preached about freedom from sin rather than freedom from Rome, about a kingdom not of this world rather than a political state. It was this very effectiveness that led to his martyrdom. According to the Golden Legend and other early church sources, Simon was killed in Persia by being sawn in half, a method of execution that was both symbolic and brutal. The saw represented the division between truth and falsehood, between the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of this world. Picture the unimaginable agony. Simon was bound securely while his executioners slowly sawed through his body. This wasn't a quick death. It was a prolonged torture designed to break his spirit and force him to recant his faith. The physical pain would have been indescribable, the psychological horror overwhelming. But historical accounts record that Simon maintained his revolutionary zeal to the very end, not for political freedom, but for spiritual truth. As the saw cut through his flesh, he proclaimed the gospel with the same passion he had once reserved for political revolution. The man who had once been willing to die for an earthly kingdom now died proclaiming a heavenly one. Simon's martyrdom reminds us that true revolution isn't about changing governments, it's about changing hearts. The former zealot discovered that the most radical thing anyone can do is surrender their life to Christ, and the most revolutionary act is dying for the kingdom of God. Jude, also known as Thaddeus or Judas, not Iscariot, was perhaps the most forgotten of the 12 disciples. But his death in Persia would ensure that his name, while often overlooked, would never be forgotten by those who heard the account of his final stand for the gospel. Jude had the unfortunate circumstance of sharing a name with Judas Iscariot, which may explain why he maintained such a low profile in the gospel accounts. But his letter in the New Testament reveals a man of deep conviction and passionate faith, one who urged believers to contend earnestly for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. Church tradition places Jude in ministry alongside Simon the Zealot in Persia and Armenia. The two apostles made an effective team, Simon with his revolutionary background and Jude with his theological depth. Their combined ministry was so successful that it alarmed the Zoroastrian priests, who saw Christianity as a threat to their religious monopoly. According to ancient sources, Jude was martyred in Armenia after refusing to worship the goddess Diana. The local priests demanded that he offer sacrifice to their goddess as a sign of respect for local customs. When Jude not only refused but boldly proclaimed that Diana was a demon masquerading as a deity, the crowd erupted in fury. Jude was beaten to death with clubs, but some accounts add that he was also shot with arrows, making his death a combination of the martyrdoms suffered by other apostles. The crowd's rage was so intense that they didn't content themselves with one method of execution, but used every weapon at hand. But like his fellow apostles, Jude faced his death with supernatural courage. Historical accounts record that as the blows rained down and the arrows pierced his body, he continued to proclaim that Jesus Christ was the only way to God. The man who had written about contending for the faith literally contended with his life for the faith. Jude's death reminds us that some apostles are forgotten by history but not by God. His ministry may not have been as prominent as Peter's or as dramatic as Paul's, but his willingness to die for Christ was just as real and just as costly. The forgotten apostle's final stand teaches us that fame isn't the measure of faithfulness, and that God values the obscure martyrs just as much as the celebrated ones. Jude died as he had lived, quietly faithful, earnestly contending, completely committed to the Christ who had chosen him to be one of the 12. When you step back and look at the complete picture of how the 12 disciples died, a pattern emerges that is both terrifying and inspiring. 11 of the 12, all except John, chose death over denial. 11 men who had walked with Jesus, talked with Jesus, and seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion, preferred torture and death to claiming that their experience had been false. This isn't just remarkable, it's historically unprecedented. Men will die for causes they believe in, but they won't die for causes they know are false. They might die for a noble lie, but they won't die for a lie they themselves created. Yet these men died specifically for their testimony that Jesus had risen from the dead, a testimony that, if false, they would have known was false. Think about the psychological impossibility of this scenario if the resurrection were a hoax. Imagine 11 men conspiring to create a lie in human history, then maintaining that lie through years of persecution, torture, and finally death. Imagine them watching each other die for something they knew was false, and never once breaking ranks or revealing the conspiracy. The testimony of blood speaks louder than any argument. These men didn't die for a philosophy or a moral code. They didn't die for a political cause or a religious movement. They died for an event, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that they claimed to have witnessed personally. This is why their deaths matter so much. They weren't dying for beliefs, they were dying for facts they had witnessed. If this evidence for the resurrection is strengthening your faith, I need you to share this video with everyone you know. The world needs to hear about the ultimate testimony these men gave with their lives. Their deaths created a testimony that has echoed through 20 centuries of church history. Every time Christians have faced persecution, they have looked back to the example of the apostles who chose death over denial. Every time believers have been called to sacrifice for their faith, they